Savage Species by Jonathan Janz. Before. It was a week before the grand opening, a week before the bloodbath. Shane Doolan slowly climbed toward consciousness. There was a smell like raw hamburger juice, and a silence so complete he was sure someone had shoved wads of cotton in his ears. Weakly, he pawed at his ears, and though there was a stiff, crusty coating on the side of his head, there were no cotton balls to obstruct his hearing. Shane opened his eyes, but everything remained black. A sickening dizziness grabbed hold of him. His chest tightened, his breathing grew labored and shallow. Wherever he was, it wasn't just dim, it wasn't just dark, it was blacker than fresh tar, blacker even than the goddamn slash marks his mom used to make on his papers, even when he brought home a C, or, on a few glorious occasions, a B. What kind of mother was that? He wondered. What kind of mom graded your papers after they'd been graded, and invariably reduced the score? He felt cold all over, cold and weak and frightened. He realized with growing distress that his lungs wouldn't work properly. Shane tried to suck in air to fight off the encroaching panic, but his attempt was futile. Jesus God, it felt like some huge object, an anvil, or his mother, was sitting on his chest. But as the nerveless feeling in his limbs began to dissipate, he realized he was lying on his stomach, and that was why his breathing was restricted. He was laid out face down on some rough, moist surface. What the hell was this? Shane made to push away from the dank rock floor, but as he did, a holocaust of pain gusted through his legs. Shane howled, flopped down on his belly, and pummeled the slimy rock with palsied fists. But now that the floodlight of pain was glowing, nothing would diminish its merciless brilliance. Shane cursed, thrashed his head in the slime, and sobbed harder than he had in his life. The pain continued to intensify. A long time later, or perhaps it was only a matter of minutes, Shane grew accustomed to the agony. Or rather, he created other pains, so his mind wasn't wholly focused on his shrieking legs. He'd bitten clear through his bottom lip. The teeth easily shredded the soft tissue until his incisors ground together like bits of gravel. He'd awakened a throbbing ache in the side of his head, which told him the crust he'd fingered earlier was dried blood. He knew this should have alarmed him. He couldn't imagine bleeding from an ear being a good thing under any circumstance. But it didn't help him stabilize his caroming thought processes and begin to analyze his situation. "You're on your belly," he told himself, "and though you're near water, you're not in danger of drowning." At least he didn't think so. Shane swallowed, made himself go on. "Your ear hurts. You've beaten the shit out of your fists and bitten through your bottom lip, and on top of that there's something seriously wrong with your legs." Shane speculated about his legs, but forced himself to stop. Things were already bad enough without adding to his catalog of miseries. A wave of dizziness steamrolled through his head, but Shane forced himself to continue assessing. Though it's a struggle, you can breathe. You can't see, but your other senses are working. Yes, Shane thought. He realized this was true. His hearing wasn't impaired. It was simply that quiet. He couldn't imagine a place this silent existing on Earth, but wherever it was. Shane sucked in a startled breath. He had it. Holy Mary, Mother of God, he thought, his sluggish thoughts quickening. You're working on the new state park, the one that's opening next weekend. You're behind schedule, and you're tired of that bitch park ranger Linda Farmer driving you and the rest of the crew like a bunch of damn mules. Shane made a face in the darkness. It wasn't like the goddamn park couldn't open if the walking bridge wasn't completed on time, but to hear Linda Farmer tell it, constructing a rope bridge over a half-flooded river was not only necessary for the park to be complete, it was also the easiest job in the world. As if she'd ever built anything before in her life. The woman wore so much makeup she looked like a deranged clown. If she couldn't even make herself look presentable, what the hell could she know about building bridges? Shane shook his head, his anger elbowing away some of the pain. If Patterson, the foreman of the crew Shane was working with, had any balls, he'd have told Linda Farmer to take her demands and her clown makeup and jump in the river. The image actually brought a half-smile to Shane's face, agony and all. And then the smile vanished, and his eyes grew very wide. He'd shared with Patterson his thoughts on the matter of the rope bridge. And Patterson the prick had elected Shane to paddle across the river in that damn canoe to find a good spot where they could begin staking out the opposite side of the bridge. Like there was any good place. The river was wide enough to begin with, but with the flooding and the muck it dredged up, Shane had been forced to climb out of the boat and slog an extra 50 feet before he found relatively dry ground. He'd stopped, pant legs soaked to the thighs and his work boots weighted down by water and mud, to take a piss, and to curse Tom Patterson, and Linda Farmer, and his mother, who'd caused him to hate school so much he'd barely graduated and never even applied for college. He'd been thinking about how unfair it all was, how nobody saw his potential or understood how smart he really was when he first noticed the cave. Patterson had told him there wouldn't be any surprises. Though the land was low-lying, the beady-eyed foreman had informed them, the peaceful valley nature preserve's terrain was fairly uniform. Eyeing the cave entrance, Shane had chuckled. Uniform my ass, he thought. He made his way to the cave entrance and peered inside. Seeing nothing, he was about to trudge back through the muddy floodplain when something, curiosity, a nasty urge to learn all he could about this new discovery so he could shove it in Patterson's face, compelled him forward into the gloom. Shane remembered edging forward, stoop-shouldered, while a gleeful momentum pushed him deeper and deeper into the dark. That was all. Had he hit his head? He must have knocked it against the low cave ceiling and lost consciousness. How else to explain the scrim of dried blood painted on the side of his face, or the amnesia with which he seemed to be afflicted? But what about his legs? Maybe, he reasoned, he'd stumbled forward, down a sharp decline perhaps, and skewered his legs on some jagged rocks. Shane heaved a frustrated breath and peered into the murk. It didn't add up. None of it did. He froze at a furtive scraping sound from somewhere behind him. Shane licked his lips, his pulse accelerating. It sounded like a small animal. A possum, maybe? It made sense. Possums were nocturnal creatures. He'd crossed the river sometime during mid-afternoon. That meant it could be dusk or later by now, and the animals that came out at night would be stirring. Sure, he thought, it was a possum. And though disgusting creatures, they were not dangerous ones. Unless, of course, they had rabies. "Oh, Jesus," Shane whispered. The wounds in his legs. Had the possums been at him? A nightmarish image of the black-eyed, white-haired creatures feasting on the meat of his legs with their disease-infested fangs made his stomach curdle. Gasping, he scuttled forward on knees and elbows, but almost instantly the conflagration in his legs forced him to the ground again. Shane moaned, beat the ground with his lacerated fists. He wanted nothing more than to escape this stinking tomb and breathe the beautiful river air again. But first he had to figure out why his legs ached so badly, why with every movement, no matter how infinitesimal, it felt as though his shins had been spitted and were roasting on an open flame. With a sharp tug of misgiving, Shane reached down and inspected the sides of his legs. His breathing stopped. At first, he refused to credit what his fingers told him. The messy, squishy horrors he touched could not be his upper thighs. Then, though the movement brought on a flare-up so intense Shane felt nauseated, He bent at the waist and forced his fingers to explore his hamstrings. It was at that point he realized where the raw meat smell was coming from. Shane shrieked, clambered forward over the slimy rock, oblivious to the protests of his ruined legs, advancing in a wild series of tortured spasms that only served to heighten his pain and terror. His thoughts churned like turbid gray water, unconsciousness tugging at him like a drowning swimmer. He'd crawled perhaps 10 or 15 feet when he heard the weird squelching noises echo somewhere behind him. Shane paused, immobile, for a long moment. Then, with a cry, he surged forward again, peering into the darkness for some sign of the cave entrance. If only he could see the daylight, or even the starlight, he'd be able to fend off whatever vile animals had been gnawing on him. He imagined the possums chewing on his flesh, or raccoons, those goddamn garbage eaters, the nasty beasts. They were so unclean they probably carried the goddamn bubonic plague. The noises behind him grew louder. Smacking sounds like bare feet on a wet floor, the clicking of toenails on stone. Shane shivered. If it was a possum or a raccoon, it was one hell of a big one. Shane heard a deep growl. He crawled faster. His legs were a howling blaze, his heartbeat a jittering jackhammer. But ahead, he couldn't believe it, there was a faint cone of light. It brightened and clarified as he drew jerkily nearer, and though he doubted his savage legs would support him, for the first time Shane attempted to gain his feet. Anguish so huge it obliterated thought squeezed him with a bone-splintering fist and hurled him face-first onto the coarse stone. He vomited long and hard on the cave floor and found himself writhing in his own regurgitated lunch. It didn't matter, though. Nothing mattered anymore, nothing but the pain. Shane abandoned himself to it. He squealed and flopped on the ground in a paroxysm of anguish. It was bright enough to see now, he realized, and unthinkingly he caught a fleeting glimpse of his lower left leg. With a deathly chill, he lifted the leg again to confirm what he'd seen. His left foot was gone. Reefed with flaps of bloody skin, only a pale, ragged stub of shin bone remained. Unable to breathe, Shane peered down at his other foot. It was gone, too. He threw up again, but this time there was nothing in his stomach to eject. Beneath the noise of his own retching and sobbing, Shane heard the approach of whatever horrid vermin had done this to him. "It's not fair," he thought. If only they'd given him a chance. If only his dad hadn't run out. If only his mom wasn't such a soul-crushing sow. If only his foreman didn't treat him like the rest of the illiterates on the crew. None of them appreciated Shane, which was why he'd ended up in this fucking cave. He was going to die here, he realized. He was dying already. He had to be. He'd lost so much blood it was a wonder he could still draw breath. The footsteps sounded just behind him. Whimpering, he pushed up on an elbow and craned his head around, expecting to see a glittering pair of black eyes staring back at him. But the eyes weren't small. They were the size of baseballs. And they weren't black, either. As Shane watched in atavistic dread, the glowing green eyes loomed nearer, until the pale figure crouched over him. Though the creature was bent-backed and moving on all fours, Shane could see it was far taller than any person could be. But this wasn't a person. This was... Shane gasped as the creature scooped him into its long, emaciated arms. And though he desperately wanted to, Shane could not look away from its luminous green eyes. Cradling him like an infant, the creature lowered its long, pale face. The twin odors of feces and animal sweat closed over Shane like a shroud. And before he could utter a plea for mercy, The creature's sharp, powerful jaws crunched through his face.